application of sensory diets. When you are using your sensory diets, you want to be interviewing the adults that are involved in that environment where the sensory diet will be utilized. So you may very well have a sensory diet for school and a different one for home, because there may be different needs in different environments and the materials may be different. I find it's the best when you are creating a sensory diet to really list out the activity suggestions so that the caregiver, the teacher, whoever is implementing that sensory diet is able to look at the ideas and choose something and go with it. So I gave an example in your handouts of a sensory diet that I have written up. It is titled A's Sensory Diet Activity Choices. So that gives you an example of what I typically like to do to write out those activity suggestions. And then you want to schedule an activity at least every 2 hours during the day. Many of the students that I work with require a sensory break every half an hour. Waiting every 2 hours is just too long. So every 2 hours is kind of that blanket suggestion, but it certainly doesn't hurt to do it more or add these activities as needed. So thinking about providing sensory-based activities prior to an activity that really requires increased focused attention, and use naturally occurring activities. So I can't stress this enough. I almost never open up a door for myself when I'm with my students. Most of the schools that I work in have pretty heavy doors, and so that's a perfect opportunity for a student to either do some pushing against that heavy door and getting some good heavy work, or if it's a pull door, they have to pull and they're getting some traction to their joints. That's also proprioception. So they're pulling that door open. So now that you have an idea of what, from part one, of what these sensory activities are looking like, you can start to see them in your environment. And so many times I have people say to me, well, I don't have any resources. I don't have enough of a budget to buy some of this equipment, because a lot of this sensory-based equipment is pretty pricey. So what do? I can't do it. Well, look around in your environment. There's plenty of things that you could use. For proprioceptive activities, I'll have students fill up their backpack and maybe drag their backpack down, or fill up your backpack to a safe weight so that you're not toppling the kids over, but putting that backpack on. And by the way, a safe weight for any sort of weighted vest is 5% of the child's body weight. So don't overstuff that weighted vest if you have a weighted vest, or think about when you are using a backpack. You don't want to have it so full that it's hurting them. You have plenty of furniture that you could potentially move around, that any sort of crawling on the floor, anything that you're pushing or pulling is going to be a proprioceptive activity. Vestibular activities you have all around you. You could, going for a walk is movement, but when I think about the most intense vestibular activities, you really want to have something that has a really fast start and stop, and that is really getting your head out of that typical posture. So typically we're upright, our head is upright. So if you're thinking about vestibular input, I think about really doing activities that are going to bring your head upside down. So even doing some dressing activities where you're putting on shoes or getting your head in just in a different position there's plenty of opportunities throughout the day that you can think about that can provide that input without needing a specialized equipment like a piece of suspended equipment like a swing. Tactile information, you have all sorts of different textures that you can cut out from different fabric. You can get different fidgets. There's so many things that I just am naturally, even just like the edge of the table, it's a natural tactile kind of fidget toy. So you don't have to have a lot of resources. You can be creative about making things or finding materials and activities that are in your environment that satisfy that need. There was a question that we received about how to provide safe sensory experiences with individuals with low vision. And I would say this is using those naturally occurring activities in your environment it's going to be your safest bet. So things like opening up the door, helping with chores, so maybe carrying, if you have laundry and they're safe going up and down the stairs, putting that laundry in a laundry bag and letting them bump it up the stairs. I provided you with a resource that's called Sensory Activities for Home and School. So that gives you a lot of actual like chores that you could choose from, or activities that are found throughout the house that you could reference. And I think really the difference with the low vision versus other students is just making sure that that low vision individual either understands the safety around their visual impairments, or you have to be right next to them. So providing that, that safe experience for them. The last thing is that we really want to encourage independence, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that encouraging independence as we get going into this webinar. So here's a slide that says some sensory diet activities specific to the home environment. So helping with the chores, carrying, pushing, dragging laundry basket. There you can make some indoor forts with cushions. You can have tickle fights and pillow fights and wrestling. Outdoor activities that you could do are going to the park, going on the swing, climbing structures, monkey bars. And then when you have a little one, and even not even little ones, you can do massage that's something that is kind of one of always my go-tos. That's something when somebody's really struggling and I know that they enjoy tactile experiences, I'll sometimes just say, can I give you a hand massage? And just giving them that hand massage with or without lotion, that will just help them get through maybe like the last 5 minutes of an assembly or the last bit of waiting time, because waiting is always a hard time. So that's something that's really helpful. And then these are some activities for the school environment. Thinking about incorporating a morning walk or morning exercises, having some sensory input during transition times, incorporating those chores, using some of the weighted equipment throughout the day. This lists a compression vest, and compression vests are basically a vest made out of a lycra material, and you're able to, it has Velcro on both the top and the sides, so you can squeeze that Velcro so it ends up making it like really tight and over the shoulders, so it's almost giving them like a hug. Something to mention about both weighted equipment and a compression vest is that your body, when you first put on a vest, weighted or compression, your body notices it. It says, okay, that's something different. I have the weighted vest on. It notices it initially, and then it pays attention to it for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then after that time, it starts to accommodate to it. And you start to stop feeling the vest, stop feeling the weight or that compression component. So then it stops having a benefit. So using a weighted or a compression vest for any longer than 20, 30 minutes, it's going to stop having any effect. But the moment you take that vest off, the person's body is going to say, oh, I just had some weight on it, and now I don't. And it pays attention to it again. So you get benefit from a weighted vest or a compression vest both when you put it on and then when you take it off. But leaving it on for hours at a time ends up, for most of the time, ends up not having an effect. So that's really important to think about. Using some seated movement activities. So sitting on a therapy ball. There's something called a move and sit, which is basically like a round or a wedge cushion almost that you inflate. And it's not fully inflated, so it allows some movement so that you get that movement in the chair versus feeling like you have to get up out of your chair to get that movement. And then I happen to be sitting in a chair that moves with that rotation movement. So that, depending on your student, may or may not be helpful. This might be too much out of control, but if it's somebody who can manage a little bit of movement and self-regulate, but find that movement really helpful, that could be beneficial. And then giving children choices between activities is helpful. So I wanted to show you some of my examples that the classrooms that I've worked with have really been able to incorporate some sensory strategies into their day. So one of the handouts I have labeled Sensory Station Schedule. So if you look at this handout, in the morning, every half an hour, there were 6 students in the classroom. And so the students are listed just with their initials on the top of the sensory schedule. And then the time is listed every half an hour. So every half an hour, every student has a sensory activity that they participate in for 5 minutes. We set the schedule. The half an hour ends about 25 minutes into that session, and we set a timer. The students initially, an adult was with each of these students, and they were told what they were supposed to do. So they had the option of bouncing on the orange therapy ball, sitting on the beanbag with a weighted blanket, jumping either on the trampoline if they could manage it, or jumping jacks, sitting on or lying over a big peanut. So it's like a therapy ball that's squished to look like a peanut. So there's a little bit of an indentation, which is perfect for just rolling over on your belly. The body sock, or getting rolled. We had this big, large rolling pin that was a styrofoam rolling pin that we would roll up and down them. Or we had this boat that was almost like this boat that was filled up with air, and when you sat into it, it kind of conformed to your body and you could rock back and forth. So those were their options, and then we just had it scheduled out. So every half an hour, they rotated through each of the different activities. And initially, they really needed help to go to each of the stations, and they needed adult assistance to participate in every single activity. But then as the school year progressed, there were certain students who were able to read, and they were able to go over to the schedule, and they'd say, you know, Billy, it's time for you to go on the ball. John, it's time for you to get rolled in the rolling pin. So they were able to, it ended up being almost a social opportunity as well, because they were able to interact and tell where they were going and get that information that they needed throughout the day. So that was something that they did in the morning. And then in the afternoon, they half an hour used the yoga cube. In this classroom, it was known as the Amanda cube because it's pictures of me doing yoga postures. So they would take this cube that has pictures of me doing a yoga posture. They would take turns rolling the cube, and whatever it came up on, they would each do the posture. So this one is a windmill, so it's just standing up tall and then reaching to touch their opposite foot, standing up, reaching to touch their opposite foot. So that was giving them that upside down movement, that vestibular movement. So I tried to pick poses that really got standing forward bend, got their heads in a different position. So that happened every half an hour. So that was a pretty easy, just scheduled opportunity that the teacher was able to do. It was very structured and controlled, and every student got what they needed. Now initially, we worked some kinks out. Initially, some of the students jumped on the trampoline and it got them way too overstimulated, and we had to make the trampoline go away. So really you have to troubleshoot. Halfway through the year, we switched up the activities because some kids got a little bit tired of things, and so just keeping it new and fresh for them was helpful as well. I often will get the question, well, I have a classroom of students that some of them need the sensory input and some of them don't. How am I supposed to manage everything? And I would say for the most part, most kids like participating in these kinds of activities. So it's not going to hurt the students who don't necessarily need that sensory input to learn. They'll still benefit from it. It's not going to hurt them. So I would still err on, if you have students in your classroom who really need and benefit from these activities, and there's more of them than not, incorporating the whole classroom is a good idea. I had mentioned earlier the sensory diet activity choices. So I list out those activity choices, but then I'm a firm believer in data collection, especially because sensory processing research is still something that is in the works. I'll get to that a little bit later. But I think it's always important for any of the techniques that you're using to make sure that they are working. And the way we know that things are working is to take data and to track their responses. So I also included in the handout a document. It says A's Sensory Diet Data Collection. And every half an hour it just says, was that sensory diet activity completed? Which one? And was there a positive response, no response, or a negative response? So you can get more detailed depending on who you're working with, but that's something to start with. I think even just taking that data helps team members make sure that that activity gets completed, because sometimes you will get halfway through the day and say, oh my gosh, I didn't really quite, so-and-so is having a meltdown and I haven't done any of the sensory activities today. Oh my gosh. Taking that data just helps kind of keep people on track. So we talked about sensory diets, and that's really going to be your practicing. So when we think about true sensory processing disorders or dysfunction, the more you practice something, in theory, the sensory dysfunction should subside, because your brain starts to develop that maturation and it develops the skills if it's a true sensory processing difficulty. But as you're working on that brain maturation, as you're working on the practice and the developing the different skills, you can't just like say, all right, well, we're working on these things, but like there's nothing else that can be done when in those hard times. We still need things to help get us through those hard times or to avoid those hard times. So The first thing to do is accommodate when necessary, when you can. So I worked with a student who had incredible hearing, and he was very interested in planes. So he would hear a plane probably a good 2 minutes before anybody else would. And when I first started working with him, he would say, plane, plane. He'd run off. I ran a group with him, a social skills group. And he'd run to the window and I hear a plane, 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 plane. And I'd be like, come back, come back. It would turn into a whole big thing. And then the plane would come and I'd be like, oh, you're right. There's a plane there. And so I could have battled back and forth with that, but I knew that, number one, I didn't want to give him noise-canceling headphones because I didn't want to cancel out all of the other good things that were going on in group. It was a social skills group. I wanted him to be able to interact with other people. So I didn't want to totally accommodate and give him those noise-canceling headphones. But what I did do and what I learned is when that happened, I would say, all right, it's a group activity. Let's take our stretching break, go take a look at the window, see the plane. There it is. All right, let's come back and get back into our activity. And I found that to be the most effective way of dealing with it. I lost less time doing that than fighting the fact that his hypersensitivity to the noise was just part of who he was. And then when possible, anticipate those difficulties, provide that accommodation before the behavior escalates. So there are certain times where you know, all right, you know what, John's mom just called and said they're not going to be able to go on the vacation that he was really looking forward to. Before I break that news to John, I may settle him in the weighted blanket, put him in the beanbag chair, let him listen to some calming music, and then start to broach that activity. So at least giving him his body some organization so he can manage something that might be potentially difficult. Also discussing upcoming changes in the schedule and a time frame that's beneficial to the child. So I think about sometimes we plan field trips and at the last minute the bus broke down, something happens, we're not able to go. But you find out maybe in the morning and you were going to go around like 11 o'clock. So sometimes it's helpful to give that warning ahead of time, and sometimes it's helpful to just say, all right, when we get to around 10:30, that would be the time. We're going to leave at 11. You know what? Things happen. Instead of ruining the whole beginning of the morning, maybe prolong that time frame. And this is something that's really hard, but I really have to stress that you don't want to provide rewards that are linked to sensory preferences. So you don't want to take away recess. You don't want to take away that outside time. But ultimately, you're kind of punishing yourself more than you are punishing or, providing a consequence for the student. So you have ways of adapting the environment. One way is to create safe play areas, and what that means is you're designating maybe parts of the room where you make rules. So say maybe we put a gate over on this side of the room or tape or whatever on the floor, and we say in this part of the room we all are going to keep our personal space. This is our bubble. This is our personal space. Nobody is allowed in anybody else's personal space. That's the rule. And you follow that rule. So so students learn that there are areas where they can feel safe. But then maybe in other areas of the room, you're teaching that, all right, you have you're providing learning opportunities, but then also having these sensory hideouts or a controlled kind of space. So say in this part of the room, the rules are just to stay safe. But if somebody bumps into you, it's not a big deal. But if that child feels like they get overwhelmed, they're able to take a break in a safe space, like a tent or an area where they can be alone for a little bit. Creating sensory rooms or a sensory cart are a nice option for a couple different reasons. So if you have resources to create a whole room with sensory input, that's really great. I mean, you could have all of your, I know I worked in a place where they had a timeout space, but then they also had like a chill out room. So they had found when they offered that chill out room, students would go there instead of getting into the timeout space, because they knew if they were able to go into the space and get the input that they need and calm down, that avoided a behavioral outburst. And sensory carts are a nice thing if you are limited in resources and you have maybe multiple classrooms in close proximity. Maybe you buy just one of everything, like one weighted blanket, one body sock, some fidget toys, and you have them all in a cart, and when it's needed, that cart moves from one classroom to the next. So that's something where maybe you're building your sensory library and you start off with a sensory cart. OTinnovations.com is a really good website that gives examples of what these sensory rooms look like, sensory carts, and how to create them. And then you always want to think about minimizing visual and auditory distractions during activities that require attention and focus. That makes sense. So this is an example. This is a little girl who's in a tent. She has a weighted blanket on her and she has some headphones on and she's reading a book. So that would be an example of one of those controlled, sensory hideouts or a break space. Structuring the routine is really helpful. Many students with sensory processing difficulties tend to get very rigid in their actions because they know what keeps them safe. So they avoid things that they worry about infringing upon their safety or their perceived safety or their anxiety level. So structuring the routine and providing that predictability is going to help just alleviate some of the anxiety around things. So trying to keep routines and possessions organized, be consistent with your rules and consequences. Having an activity schedule posted is helpful. So if we know that mealtime at school is a really challenging time, knowing, having that visual schedule so that they know when it's going to happen, and then maybe even starting to build up, okay, lunch is in another half an hour. What could we do now to help get your body ready for lunch so that you're going to be more successful? And using that activity schedule to your advantage. And then creating routines for difficult times of the day. So knowing that, okay, so if lunchtime is a difficult time, and lunch is at 12, maybe around 11:30, you start to do a bunch of swinging activities or heavy work activities, proprioceptive activities, and then you read a social story around mealtime, and then you listen to some music, and then you are able to go to lunch. I'm going to talk about social stories in a moment. So this is an example of a visual schedule. This student actually was able to read time, so it has clocks, the time on the clock, and then right next to it, it has the activity. And you could even add to this by, once they're done with the activity, that you take that activity. So all of the activities are on Velcro, so you can switch it around. You take that activity off, and then you put it in an all done box or bin or whatnot. So the student knows that they're done and it's on to the next thing. This is an example. This slide shows you an example of a short social story. So the idea behind a social story is just providing visuals of a potentially difficult time that also provides the preferred action related to that time. So for this one, it's related to a fire alarm. So it says, the noise you hear is a fire alarm. It is okay. Get in line behind me. So I tend to write social stories so that I say, I hear a fire alarm, it's okay, I get in line behind my teacher. So written from the student's perspective. But the idea behind it is really when you get overwhelmed with a lot around you, your processing and comprehension starts to decline. Your cognitive skills start to decline when you get overwhelmed. So using visual strategies is helpful because you eliminate some of the overwhelming components of the environment. Now, if you have low vision, you have to think about what's going to be the most helpful in that situation. So maybe it is reading a Braille social story, or maybe it is getting very short, concrete directions. Fire alarm, I'm okay, follow my teacher. So thinking about some strategies or having maybe some tactile, something, this is what I hold when I need to hold my teacher's hand. This helps make me feel calm, and I walk with my teacher. So tapping into some of the other sensory aspects. This slide just shows you that you can also just write out, if a student's able to read, write out that schedule. Sometimes I find it really helpful in the moment when somebody's having a hard time, just taking out a dry erase board, writing down my direction and showing it, and that's more helpful than just saying, time for the bathroom, let's go to the bathroom, okay, let's go to the bathroom, time for the bathroom. Sometimes just writing it down, go to the bathroom, and they go to the bathroom, or showing them the picture. This is a slide of a student who used to have this access to this sign whenever it says, if you are feeling upset, say, I need a break. And then they had the option of going to the fish tank for a walk or getting a sensory break, and that break was for 2 minutes. So whenever he was having a hard time, he did not have to use his words per se. He was prompted to use his words, but all he really needed to do was pick up this piece of paper, give it to a teacher, and then he was allowed to have that break, versus acting out or having a challenging incident. So ultimately, when you're first starting with a student and they're not quite aware of their sensory needs, the first thing is figuring out what works for that student. What's going to help either calm them down or bring up their arousal level, depending on the student that you're working with. Once you start, initially, you identify those activities that are helpful, and initially, usually, an adult needs to really make sure that those are happening. But ultimately, we want to educate everyone involved so that the child can take over some of that responsibility. So we want to educate the child, educate the parents, families, and caregivers, and the team that are working with the child. So there's a couple good programs that help with that, promoting independence. One is called How Does Your Engine Run? And the other is called the Zones of Regulation. So both of those are listed in my bibliography that you can reference. Both of the programs teach appropriate language and really label the arousal level that the student is at. So the first thing that you want to do is just really talk about, oh, your arms are calm, your legs are calm, your body is sitting in the chair. I can tell that you are ready to learn. Really labeling and identifying what learning looks like, or what calm behavior looks like. How does your engine run uses your engine. So it says your engine is running high. If it's running high, what do we need to do to bring it back so it's running just right? Or your engine is running low, you need to give it some energy so it's going to be running just right. So the first thing is just having the child be able to identify what state they're at. And then you can start really having them pick activities that might help them when they're in the state that they're at. So using self-rating tools is really helpful. I have adolescents that and adults that really find using some sort of checklist or questionnaire to guide what activities they would like to be presented. In your handout, you have the sensory diet exploration and activity checklist, and that really is provided to you so that you can, if you're working with adolescents, you say, all right, let's sit down, let's take a look. All right, here are some movement things. Which ones do you like to do? Riding a bike, running or jogging, dancing, lifting weights? Let's check off these. If none of them work for you, let's go down to the next one. Let's look at different types of touch and temperature. Do you like a weighted blanket? Do you like getting massages? How about taking a hot bath? So it really lets that person check off the things. And I know that there are certain adolescent units that have, that's part of the admit package, is that they spend some time looking over this checklist, and then this checklist is posted outside of their room, and it's, okay, when I'm having a hard time, please offer me one of these. And it really allows that person to have some control over what they're doing. And teaching that self-advocacy skills, saying I need a break. I'm not feeling right now. I need to do some jumping. So this is an example of one of the visuals, the zones of regulation. So the zones of regulation breaks up your arousal level into different categories. So they have blue zone, green zone, yellow zone, and red zone, and then it has some emotion. So it works on the emotional kind of component to these different areas as well. This is a visual from How Does Your Engine Run, and it just says, you can hold this up for a student and say, all right, I'm looking at your body right now, you're running just right. Or when they start to get overstimulated, you move it to the red and you say, your engine's running way too fast. Both of those programs are good programs to look at and decide really what works for your age group and your level of functioning of students that you're working with. This is from the zones of regulation, and it just offers, they provide handouts that you can cut out and use as visuals. So you say, all right, right now you look like you need a sensory break. What would you like to do? And you can choose one of the cards. All right, so let's talk about the research related to sensory processing. So there's research out there. The difficulty with the research is that a lot of it is literature reviews, and many of the studies have a really small population size. So because sensory processing is a really hard thing to nail down and to make very empirical, it's been hard to measure change. So I know that there's a study with adults of the effects of a weighted blanket. So they had adults come in and they had them rate their anxiety level, and then they spent some time with a weighted blanket, and then after the weighted blanket they again rated their anxiety level, and then they said, okay, their anxiety was overall reduced from the use of this weighted blanket. The difficulty with children is they're not always so reliable about reporting how they're feeling, and not everything's so easy to say like, oh, let's rate your anxiety. Anxiety is pretty subjective too. Activity level is very subjective. So that's what's made it more difficult to really pin down some of the research on sensory strategy. But that needs to happen if the diagnosis is going to be made, it's going to make it into the next version of the DSM. If you are looking for good articles, there's lots of good articles in Sensory Processing Disorder Foundation. All right, we're going to take a sensory break. So if you have been watching this webinar from its start all the way through, this is a perfect time to take a sensory break. If you've been moving around during this and stopping and starting it, you may want to wait for a time to try the sensory break after you've been sitting for a while. But we're going to take a sensory break and see how it impacts your ability to listen and focus on the last little bit of this webinar. The first thing that you want to do is set up your paper so that you have two almost like railroad tracks. And I'm going to time you for 10 seconds. And what you're going to do is you're going to make a line that touches both the top line and the bottom line, but doesn't go through either. And you're going to make as many lines in 10 seconds as you can till I say stop. Ready, set, go. Go ahead and stand up. First thing that we're going to do is 10 jumping jacks. So here we go, all together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now your next one, you have you have options, different versions of push-ups. So you can get on the ground and do push-ups. For the sake of you being able to see me, I'm going to do table push-ups. You can do chair push-ups, wall push-ups. So anything where you are getting that push-up motion. We're going to do 10 of them. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. Now find a chair or something that you can put your foot up on. You're going to raise your arms up, and then you're just going to touch your toes 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Other side. Keep yourself balanced. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, stand up tall. Bring your hands together. We're going to do what we call prayer pushes. So you're just pushing the palms of your hands together for 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then just take each of your fingers and then just give them a good pull. You might hear some cracking. Both hands. All right, and then we're going to end with 3 deep breaths through your nose and out. All right, have a seat. Now that we've returned from our sensory break, you're again going to make those 2 railroad tracks. We're going to do that same task again. You're going to see how many lines you make this time. When you're done, you're going to count up the number of lines you got on before your sensory break, and then the number of lines you've got after your sensory break. And we're going to compare the two. Ready, set, go.
The purpose of that sensory activity, the sensory break, is to see how sensory experiences work for you. So if you count the first trial before we did any sort of sensory break, typically the number that you have on the first try compared to the trial after the sensory break changes. I've done lectures many times, and in all of my experiences, most of the time when I say have people's numbers increased on that second trial, many people, most of the room raises their hand. And I say, has anybody, has their numbers decreased? Maybe I'll have maybe one person out of a room, fairly large groups, that will raise their hand. And then I'll say, anybody's numbers stay the same. And I'll get a few hands here and there. So I really like this activity because I think it highlights that that sensory break didn't take very long, but you can increase your attention and your arousal level and your ability to learn by taking these short sensory breaks. And even if you're not one of the people whose numbers increased, they at least stayed the same, which doesn't hurt you anyways. Either way, taking that time maybe gets your exercise up for the day. You can count the steps on your Fitbit. And every so often there's one person who might not benefit from a sensory break, and that's when that's an individual you'd have to try at some point, realize it doesn't work for them, and then not have them participate in that sensory break. But most often than not, we have positive experiences with the sensory break, and I really think it highlights your ability to take a short amount of a break and have a nice effect from it.
Other points of interest. Oftentimes, children who have attention disabilities will look like they have sensory processing disorders. The big thing to know the difference between the two is if somebody has a true sensory processing disorder, they will get better with treatment over time, within 6 months to a year or so. There's a certain amount of time, and their brain starts to develop that maturation, and they normalize. That sensory processing starts to normalize. Children with attention, ADHD, ADD, they have this kind of attention issue, and it's pervasive throughout their lifetime. So kids with sensory processing difficulties like routine and ritual. They really like to have a routine. Kids with ADHD or attention difficulties they really alert to novel sensations. Children with sensory processing difficulties prefer the adult familiar activities. Children with ADHD prefer that novelty and being the diversion of something new. Children with sensory processing difficulties tend to have reduced motor coordination or have a little bit more difficulty with that coordination, whereas kids with ADHD tend to really excel in sports. Children with sensory processing disorders usually have pretty good impulse control, whereas kids with ADHD tend to be more impulsive. So I think the other big thing is children with sensory processing difficulties don't really benefit from an attention medicine or some sort of stimulant, whereas children with attention ADHD may be helped by medication. Now, a question I get often is, how do you address self-stimulatory behaviors? So any of the areas, those sensory areas that we talked about, there could be self-stimulatory behaviors that you see with students. So I would say having those self-stimulatory behaviors, it serves a purpose for that child. So there's some sort of common component or alerting component that compels the child to do those behaviors. So I wouldn't say ban them completely, that they're not allowed. However, if they're interfering with their ability to be functional and complete activities, then there needs to be some kind of rules around them. So I tend to put boundaries around, okay, so I have a student who, let's say, they do a lot of eye poking. I get that a lot. And that is certainly providing an intense visual experience. If you're poking your eye, you're getting those white little dots that that give you some more visual input. So, okay, that's not something that's going to help you focus on a tabletop activity in front of you. So I'll say, maybe I shouldn't say that eye poking because that's really not good for your eye health. But let's say like maybe flicking by your eye. So that's something where I would say, all right, in between at the end of our session, you can have some time doing that. But right now, I'm going to set the timer while we're in OT, while we're doing whatever your activity may be. Hands are down, hands are in the activity. And then anytime they bring their hands up to do any sort of that self-stim, then I'm just lightly redirecting their hands back to the activity and say, all right, in 10 minutes, you'll be able to have your break time. And dealing it with it like that. The next question I get often is more sensory the better. And I always say sensory breaks are good, but as I mentioned with the trampoline, if you get too much, sometimes it can send you over to the other edge. So I think you're only going to know is more sensory the better based on the child's behavior and their ability to learn. So if they get to the point where learning is no longer an option, they've gone over into that overstimulating area, then I would say they probably don't benefit from more sensory. And then is it sensory or is it challenging behavior? And I have a really good slide here that I like. So this slide really is a nice slide that highlights the difference between challenging behavior that might occur due to sensory processing versus something else. So this person is characterizing a meltdown as challenging behavior occurring from sensory difficulties, and a tantrum as challenging behavior, big time challenging behavior from whatever. So the common denominator between both, that challenging behavior can look like screaming, kicking, shouting, stomping, swearing, biting, throwing, hitting, any of the real challenging behavior is going to look the same in either. But a meltdown, where it's due to sensory difficulties, is going to be driven by a reaction to something. Whereas a tantrum is usually driven by a want or a goal, or maybe avoiding something. A meltdown is going to be a reaction to overload or feeling overwhelmed, whereas a tantrum is usually because they want something or they want to avoid something. A meltdown, a child does not care if anyone's paying attention, whereas a tantrum is usually that child is checking that an adult is paying attention to the behavior. A meltdown will continue regardless of whether or not somebody is watching, because they are so overstimulated by the environment, by the situation, that it doesn't really matter what else is going on. Like, this is their way of managing their overstimulation. Versus a tantrum, a child might act this way in front of an audience, but when somebody leaves, they may stop. A meltdown, there's really no goal. The behavior only stops once the child has calmed down or they're able to get their body back into control. Versus a tantrum, once the child gets what they want, the behavior will end abruptly. And then with a meltdown, you'll really see that signs, the physical signs that the child has lost control, like the sweating, the red face, the flatulence, their dilated pupils, and it takes them time to recover physically from this meltdown. Versus the tantrum, that nervous system, once that goal is achieved, the child returns back to their normal state pretty quickly. So I just really like the way this slide kind of highlights things, and it makes you think about how it's looking and what's the intent behind. Really, a true sensory processing meltdown is a loss of control of their physical well-being. How do we want to integrate sensory processing strategies into an educational plan, or if you are working as an outpatient therapist, into your goals? If you're a parent, really how to advocate for sensory strategies being integrated into your child's education plan. I really believe that understanding sensory processing and how you're dealing with difficulties goes under the methodology section. It's really how is somebody teaching the child to address these sensory processing needs. So it really goes under that methodology section, and then any of the equipment that you use to support that methodology goes in the accommodation section. I tend to avoid writing objectives around sensory processing unless they really have a functional, measurable outcome. So student will engage in sensory break to allow him to participate in 15 minutes of writing in 3 out of 4 measured opportunities. So something along those lines. So that maybe you're incorporating it into the objective, saying like this is the setup that the child needs to be successful to participate in this activity. So I think understanding sensory processing, what difficulties look like, how you can manage them, allows you to really appreciate the students that you work with, the children that you are parents to, and really allow you to have fun with them. So I'd like to end with this final slide that says, gradually our child has blossomed and we have learned to do something with him which I never thought would be possible. We learned to enjoy him. He is our favorite companion. Understanding sensory processing difficulties, what it looks like, it really allows us to empathize with the difficulties that some of our students are going through. And if we understand the reason for why they may be having these meltdowns and having difficult times, it's going to help us be able to offer them the things that they need to be successful and to learn. Thank you.
So a couple questions that we had come in for you. This one comes from a horticultural therapist and certified teacher here actually at the Perkins School for the Blind. The question is this: I am curious about your experience and or thoughts towards the use of environmental sounds while working with our population. What is your experience with the use of water features, water sounds, and even white noise to enable our children to remain calm or calm down after sensory overload? What about utilizing environmental sounds while working indoors to replicate the outdoor arena?
I think that's a great question, and I do tend to use sound depending on the profile of the student. So if you have a student who is hypersensitive and is going to get stuck on sounds, then you want to minimize the amount of extraneous noise in the environment. Or if something like a white noise machine is utilized and it kind of allows them to focus on you and gets rid of maybe some of the extra noise in the environment, that's not a bad thing. I tend to use music a lot to influence the arousal level of our students. I tend to use more calming music, so I do think that that's really helpful. And I even think having headphones, so it's coming directly right in, is a nice, it gives some pressure to the ears, and you just can see some students melt into the calmness. But be really careful about what music you choose and trial it out. And I think ultimately you have to see how the person responds. So if that response is a positive one, that's something that you want to continue doing. I also think the second component of that question about using sounds inside to replicate outside noises is certainly a good way to desensitize or to expose a student to a new or unfamiliar sound. So I would say unless there's a big aversion to it, I would go ahead and use it. And even if there is an aversion to it, maybe you start by having them listen to 3 seconds of that sound and then taking a break and then making it 5 seconds of the sound and then slowly increasing the increments of time so that you are providing that almost exposure therapy so that they are able to learn how to manage difficult sounds.
Our next question comes from a pre-service TDI who's enrolled in a master's degree program at UMass Boston, and she's also the mother of 2-year-old twins affected by ROP and congenital cataracts. The question is this, and it regards about providing safe sensory experiences for toddlers. Hi, my son with low vision is 2 years of age. He and his twin sister came at 24 weeks gestation, and like many preemies, both of them really seek out a lot of sensory feedback. Joe in particular is very interested in moving heavy objects around the house, cribs and other furniture in the nursery, a tote filled with books across the kitchen floor, etc. What is he getting from this kind of input? What is the mechanism, and what other safe experiences can we provide that would benefit Joe? How would you suggest we can help children with low to no vision get the sensory input that they need from anything?
All right, so I think that I touched a little bit upon that in the lecture, but to highlight the reason why people seek out those activities is because there's that need in their body that they need something fulfilled. And clearly he's telling you proprioception is the area that he really needs. So pushing those, pushing the crib, pushing furniture, carrying heavy things around the house, I think is a very independent, appropriate way of fulfilling those needs. I think if you're looking for additional activities, you could look into weighted equipment, weighted blanket, carrying a backpack maybe that has a little bit more weight to it. But in my opinion, he's doing some very functional, appropriate things right now. So I wouldn't necessarily discourage any of that. I would, if anything else, add other maybe on the list of suggestions that I provided that might have some ideas for you there.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Amanda, for answering those questions.
Thank you.